Matthew Dunlap, who is seeking the Democratic nomination in Maine's 2nd Congressional District, announced a coalition today that's supporting his campaign. The current state auditor and former Secretary of State held a gathering at the University of Maine at Augusta to launch Women for Dunlap. Members of the group and Dunlap spoke about their priorities regarding women's health care, universal child care, equal pay, and generally a more affordable life. The coalition says Dunlap is the best option to tackle these issues.
Most often, women are the primary caregivers in a household. Whether they, should be or not is, that's a cultural thing. But the expectation is that a lot of these issues will fall upon women disproportionately. You have a lot of single mothers, one-parent families, and those economic issues take greater scope when you're only making 86% of what a man in an equivalent job is making.
Understands the struggles that families are dealing with right now: the rising cost of groceries, the impossible cost of childcare, and the constant worry about whether you can afford the health care your family needs.
Dunlap says he likes his chances in the primary and wouldn't bother running if he felt he couldn't win. Dunlap entered the primary race before current Congressman Jared Golden announced he won't seek re